right, well, welcome everyone to tonight's conversation on the role of large carnivores in rewilding ecosystems. I've been eagerly anticipating this conversation, and it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome so many participants, my brilliant colleague, Shelby Perry, and our esteemed guest, Dr. Mark Elbroch. I'm Sophie Earhart, the Vermont Land Steward for Northeast Wilderness Trust, and I'm delighted to be the facilitator tonight. I've had a preview of the slides and videos that will be shared, and you are in for a real treat. For those of you who aren't familiar with Northeast Wilderness Trust, we were founded nearly a quarter of a century ago to fill a niche in the land trust arena. We are the only regional land trust that works exclusively on rewilding. We are a land trust that has an ecocentric focus. So while we conserve forever wild landscapes for nature and people, our guiding star is the core belief that nature and all of our wild cousins have intrinsic value, independent of and superseding any value we may or may not ascribe to them from our human perspective. Currently, we protect more than 93,000 acres across New England and northeastern New York. In a few moments, we'll be joined by our presenters, but first, a couple of housekeeping points. The first is, if you have any issues with Zoom during the webinar, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to let us know, and we will try to help you sort it out. Secondly, the format of tonight's webinar is Mark will present first, then Shelby, followed by a conversation between the two of them. After that, there'll be a Q&A with you, the participants. Please submit your questions using that same Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Do not use the chat. I don't even know if you can, it's disabled. The webinar hosts will see your questions, and we will do our best to ask the presenters as many as possible, which they will do verbally, but we won't be typing answers to questions in the Q&A. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists today. Do you guys want to turn on your cameras? Mark Elbroch serves as the director for Panthera's Puma program, for which he designs science-based conservation strategies for pumas, also known as cougars, mountain lions, and here in Vermont, of course, catamounts. If I tried to convey the extent of Mark's research and work on behalf of pumas, we'd be here all night. But if you look at his bio on the Panthera website, you will have a feast of research papers, awards, feature articles, and books to choose from. While he has conducted research and engaged in conservation in several US states and in other countries, he has a strong connection to the Northeast. Mark's family moved to New Hampshire when he was in 5th grade. He lived across southern New Hampshire and attended boarding school near the coast, college in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and then lived in southern Vermont. Mark worked for Paul Resendez, teaching wildlife tracking classes in Massachusetts and in southern Vermont and New Hampshire. It's a real honor to have you here with us tonight, Mark. Shelby Perry is the director of the Wildlands Ecology Program at Northeast Wilderness Trust, an initiative of the Trust aimed at conducting, supporting, and sharing ecological research pertaining to wildlands, along with inventorying ecological values on the Trust's protected lands. She's a frequent speaker around the Northeast on the topics of wildlands, rewilding, and old forests, and has twice co-taught the Old Forest Ecology classes for North Branch Nature Center's Biodiversity University. When not working in them, Shelby can usually be found playing in wild forests, exploring them on foot, in snowshoes, or through the lens of her camera. If you've been on our website, you've seen some of her beautiful photography. It is a real treat to work with and learn from Shelby, and an honor to introduce her to you tonight. Welcome, Mark and Shelby. We're going to turn the slides and the mic over to you now, Mark, for your presentation.
Well, thanks. Wonderful to be here. And as you said, I do have a connection with New England, and it's, even if I'm not there physically right now, it's just nice to be there in spirit. So I'm just going to share my window, and let's see. Oh, I need to pull up the slideshow. There we go. All right. Well, I'm going to dive in because we don't have a whole lot of time. And the work I'm going to talk about specifically is a collaboration between Shelby and others at Northeast Wilderness Trust, Tompkins Conservation, Michigan Technical University, and the Ohio State University, as well as the organization I work for, which is called Panthera. And I'm just going to dive in because we've been sort of exploring the potential for recovery of cougars or mountain lions in the Northeast US and easternmost Canada, and other topics as well. But first, I would like to introduce the species. I find it's always a good idea to begin with a video. It's a visual representation of the animal. This is an animal that has the world record for the most common names. Some were listed by Sophie right at the start. Our team has been sort of collating different names, and we're well over 250 different names found across the Americas. And that's because this species has the widest distribution of any wild terrestrial mammal in the Americas, stretches from southernmost Alaska, about the middle of Canada, all the way down through North America to the tip of South America. And think about historically how many cultures and different peoples that range would have covered, all of which had a unique name for the species. And to introduce them more completely, I thought I would just share sort of I'm going to do 7 facts about the animal, and it'll sort of just kind of introduce what they are and who they are and what they could potentially be in an ecosystem. So number 1, I would just emphasize that this animal is highly connected to other species. And we're talking hundreds of species of mammals, birds, flora, and fauna that are all connected to this animal, either directly or indirectly. And because of this incredible number of connections, they are one of the species that more than others support biodiversity, ecosystem health, and the ability for an ecosystem to rebound, which we call resilience. Number 2, I would just emphasize that mountain lions, I tend to say mountain lions because of places I've lived and worked, they learn throughout their lives. They are not born little killing machines like many people thought for many, many years, but they actually are born curious species and animals that then have to learn from their mother and then continue to learn even after they've left their mother, establish their own territories, and begin to live life as an independent mountain lion. And that's really important as well. Number 2, these animals are incredibly curious, but more so than most other large carnivores, they are absolutely ruled by caution. And this is just a wonderful insight into the secret lives of mountain lions. That was an adult female. She woke up, she stretched, she cleaned her claws, and she just began to play all alone with a stick in the woods. And it's just, I love that insight. Moving on, hopefully. One thing I like to just talk about, oops, I forgot to center that, is that what we know about mountain lions so far is that they hunt the species, or they actually look, let's put it that way, they look and search for certain animals more than others. And all the evidence suggests that what they look for is the most common hoofed animal wherever they live. It's usually a deer species or elk. In some places in South America, it could be a vicuña or a guanaco, which are members of the llama family, but it's always the most abundant, wild, hoofed animal wherever they live. And that they hunt other kinds of animals, including livestock, that they might encounter while searching for the ones that they're looking for. So if they are moving through deer habitat and they suddenly come out of the woods because there's a little clear-cut area with a house in the middle of it and there's goats in the backyard, that might create the opportunity for them to hunt livestock. And thankfully, we can kind of encourage coexistence with the species by just protecting the animals around us, as can be seen here in the lower photo. The last thing, or number 5, I'll say, is that these animals are incredibly family centric. We always sort of thought of the species as being, aloof, a solo animal, solitary in every capacity. But what we've learned is that, yes, they tend to hunt alone and thus are considered solitary because they are seeking food on their own. They don't work with other mountain lions to sort of have a strategy on how to bring down an elk. But other than that, females, spend over 80% of their lives in the company of kittens. That these animals are always interacting with each other, constantly in physical contact with each other, sort of reconnecting, not just physically, but you can see them sort of establishing their bonds when they're separated for as little as 20 minutes from each other. And that's not just true of the family units, but their neighbors, of which they share the same landscapes, they're always interacting as well. And this right here, what you're seeing is a mother sort of just checking in with her, trying to remember how old he was at the time, about 18-month-old male kitten who's already substantially larger than her. And you can see she just comes in and just like a mother who's sort of checking the collar and cleaning up her teenage boy before he heads out. But she's just reconnecting with her son because he had been away for 20 minutes feeding on a nearby carcass. The next thing I'll emphasize is that mountain lions, you can read it if you'd like, they live in communities. And what we've learned is that, like any other animal, we sort of used to think that they were just sprinkled like seeds on a landscape, that they're sort of randomly placed. But in fact, they live in these small independent communities and they're governed by adult males. And they sort of define the geographic boundaries of a community. And within that community, they're frequently interacting with each other, often sharing food as a social currency, and that there'll be a neighboring community governed by another male. Interactions across those community lines occur, but much less frequently than within a community. And thus, when you view a sort of a mountain lion population across a landscape, I think of it now as like puzzle pieces of a mosaic in which each piece is a little community governed by a male. And last but not least is that these populations, so a population of mountain lions, which is typically defined by geography. Historically, it would have been things like huge mountain ranges, a really wide river, a huge flat desert with nothing in it or hardly anything that could sustain a mountain lion. Those things used to separate groups of mountain lions from each other. And then occasionally a young mountain lion would grow up and say, I'm just going to head out in search of a territory and cross this barrier, this hostile landscape to reach another population of mountain lions, and then to join that group and share genetic material. Today, most mountain lion populations, the primary barrier is large highways. So that's, we still have deserts and the impact of big rivers and things like that. But in addition to all that, we have major highways that are separating them from each other. I'm going to briefly cover some of the work we've been doing that's focused on the East. And so mountain lions right now, as of today, they live in the Western United States and Canada, and further south from there. And they are absent in all of the Eastern United States and Canada, except for a tiny population in Florida, due to what, the human persecution that occurred over the last 200 years of the species. And they haven't really been present in the East in over 100 years. But when you look at the human footprint across the United States, it is radically different in the East. This is just a night light sky map of the United States, and you can see just how brilliantly bright it is in the East. Is it even possible to see cats return? So we set out really with 3 big questions. Number 1, is there habitat in the East that could support mountain lions? Number 2, are there large contiguous blocks of habitat that could support a population of mountain lions that's isolated from other populations of mountain lions? And number 3, The rumor is they're on their way. They're recolonizing former range. How long do we have to wait for them to arrive and establish populations in the east and recolonize the region? Again, I'm going to be super fast here just because of time. The answer to question one is there's lots of habitat. And this map right here, the bluest color shows the best habitat for mountain lions, and the yellowest color is the worst. And what's interesting is this black line, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but the black line sort of cutting the western United States, that's where they live today. And the bluest colors, which you can see all down the East Coast, there's no mountain lions there. But the potential for mountain lions is huge. It's actually better quality habitat than where they live today. Second, we worked with other folks. This is Than Robinson in the corner there, just trying to acknowledge some of the people that contributed to this work. We did a sort of threshold approach, and we looked at all the different characteristics of habitats that could support mountain lion, and we found that there are 17 huge blocks of habitat in the east that could support mountain lion populations over time, even if they're disconnected from other mountain lion populations, either in the west or other ones in the east. 13 of those were over 10,000 square kilometers, which we consider a threshold for maintaining a healthy population in isolation, meaning that they have the genetic diversity amongst themselves to maintain a healthy population over time. And then number three, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. They're coming, right? So how long is it going to take for cats in the West to really repopulate the eastern United States and eastern Canada? And that is an interesting question. And I think this is super exciting research we built together with Tom Glass and some others. Tom Glass was the postdoctoral researcher who led this analysis, and I want to acknowledge him. And we did this amazing amount of work to build a model that could realistically forecast how mountain lions are moving eastward in the US and Canada. And the first thing I would just emphasize is that young dispersing mountain lions, which is a mountain lion that's born in what we call the natal range. And once they grow up, they say, okay, I'm leaving mom and her territory, and I'm setting off to find my own. During that process, we call them a disperser or a transient. And then residents are adults with established territories. And I just wanted to point this out, the big difference on how they move and how they make decisions when they encounter barriers like big highways. So if you can see my cursor, I'll lead you through it with words as well. Highway 8 in the north here is going east-west. That gets about 20,000 cars per day on that stretch of highway. And then down the side is Highway 12, which varies. It can have as little as 8,000 cars per day or up to 15,000 cars per day, depending on where you are in that stretch of highway. The yellow is a young male, and you can see that he takes the risk and crosses these crazy barriers, these crazy highways where there's a chance that they're going to be struck by a car and killed. A resident male here in black does not, or very rarely, will take the chance to cross a highway with 10,000 cars per day or more. And so the residents generally establish territories that are sort of defined by the local landscape and especially the highways, whereas youngsters will charge on and try to cross them. Because of this, we used dispersers to build our model. Like we used how dispersers move in the West to predict how they'll move when they go east. The other big thing I'll point out for understanding the species is that there's kind of three categories, big categories of mountain lions. They're not all the same. There's resident males, which are adult males with a territory. There's resident females, which are adult females with territories. They can or sometimes are or often are accompanied by dependent young, as you can see here. And then the third category are those dispersers or transients. They're the young mountain lions that do not have territories, that are sort of shooting all over the place like electrons. We went back in time and started our model in 1995 because we've kind of know what's happened over that 20-year period leading to 2015. And it predicted that young dispersing males, they were going to move all over the place. And that was all these red dots. That was where these animals were likely to end up based on the model's prediction. And in fact, during that time period, mountain lions were found mostly on highways that had been killed in this area. And these are almost entirely males because males are obligate dispersers. They almost always take off far from their mother, whereas female youngsters tend to set up a territory, if it's available, right next to their mother, sometimes even overlapping with her. Just to point out kind of a fun fact that we actually know that a cat dispersed successfully from South Dakota all the way to Connecticut in 2011. A young male mountain lion, they think it's the longest dispersal ever documented for a terrestrial mammal, roughly 1,800 miles. And in fact, you can see little red dots that even our model predicted that, in theory, some young cats should have been able to make it that far. But when we run the model to say, how long will it take for females who disperse more slowly to catch up to those males and for them to meet in space and time so that they can have the opportunity to reproduce and create kittens and begin to build populations, the story is radically different. We projected the model all the way to 2100, 77 years from when we ran the model in 2023. And we predicted that mountain lions will likely or unlikely reach even the western edge of the Great Lakes. In the middle there is the percentage chance or the percentage of simulations that established a projected breeding event between a male and a female mountain lion in these new regions. So in Minnesota, there's a 30% chance that we'll see mountain lions breeding in the next 77 years. You can see Oklahoma, 32%, and the dark black is sort of where the model most often predicted where there would be successful establishment of new mountain lion populations. And that's kind of depressing. And what's that linked to is mostly to do with this road network. And in C here, pane C, you can see that these are the networks of major highways, and they get denser and denser and denser as you move east. One last thing I'll just point out that we learned through this process, and it makes total sense, of course, when you think about it, is that dispersal distances are shorter where there's good habitat, because a mountain lion doesn't have to go far to find all the things it needs to survive and live on its own. But in areas where there's like strip malls, large agricultural fields, things that are not really great for mountain lions, they tend to disperse faster because it's almost like island hopping. And so these are the areas where we had contiguous habitat where they could just go a little bit of a ways. And this is, again, almost depressing that, in Canada, for instance, where there's great habitat, that in the next 77 years, we expect their mountain lion populations to expand by 250 kilometers. It's like 2 to 3 kilometers a year. I'm almost done here. And again, just pointing out that the two leading causes of death for dispersing mountain lions predicted by the model are hunting in the Midwest. So we should really take every opportunity to reduce hunting as they move eastward to kind of just make sure that we protect them while they reestablish their populations. And number two is road mortality, which is a really complex issue and difficult to deal with, given the scale of the problem and how many bridges and underpasses would need to be built to facilitate a peaceful or a sort of safe passage as they move east. Importantly for us, about 9% of those females that disperse from Western populations will survive and will reproduce. Yes, they're coming, but I'll just say it's gonna be a long time. And this is a map of the Black Hills where the 2011 cat originated from in South Dakota. And it took 20 years for mountain lions breeding in the Black Hills to move to the Pine Ridge region of Nebraska, which is not that far. And that's sort of a realistic check on our expectation for when they might get east. Of course, this raises the question, do we want to help them? Do we want to actually facilitate a return and recovery of this species in the east? And that would require active facilitation, meaning translocation. Thanks for listening. There's the list of all the folks that I work with, Shelby included, Tom Butler, Sawyer Downey, Jeremy Bruscotter, Ben Gassimi, John Vucetich, Emily Carollo, Vanessa Castle, Renaa, and myself. There's our contact information. Please reach out to Shelby or myself. If you want to read about any of this stuff, it's all been published and you can just dive in. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was so interesting. And those slides, those videos were so delightful to see. I didn't know that their best habitat is right here in the east, but it makes sense. I mean, lots of forest, lots of deer.
It's all about rain and primary productivity, and the east is just rich. And you think about, like, as someone who's lived out there, you know, these forests that have hazelnuts and hickory nuts and acorns and beech nuts, and there's so much food. And that's why you see black bear densities just incredible throughout the east, as opposed to many places in the west, and other species just so abundant and so healthy in the east because of all of that rich resource based on primary productivity.
Very cool. Okay, so Shelby, you're back. And I will, before I turn off my camera, I just want to remind people you can submit questions. We want some questions, so go to the Q&A button and type something in for us. And you can take it away, Shelby.
Okay, let me just turn on my slideshow there. All right, so I'm just going to talk really quickly about connectivity and rewilding. I think Mark ended there his beautiful presentation with some points about connectivity and wildlife movement, and I just wanted to do sort of a little bit more on that and connecting to rewilding and Northeast Wilderness Trust. So connectivity, here's a definition from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation: the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement. So this is the basics. What does connectivity mean? What does it have to do with conservation? Connectivity and similar terms permeability refer to the degree to which regional landscapes encompassing a variety of natural and semi-natural and developed land cover types are conducive to wildlife movement and to sustain ecological processes. So these terms, connectivity, permeability, corridors, and linkages, they're all critical planning tools today. They're a way we think about how we are sharing the landscape with wildlife, both plants and animals, moving for their own lives and in response to climate change. So this is how we need to, the way we think about making room in our own growth and development for other beings, from wide-ranging cats, like the ones Mark talked about, to the blowing seeds and creeping rhizomes of plants. Connectivity is critical to the continued survival of them all. And I just want to remind everyone that it is also a pretty new concept. The modern conservation movement started with national parks and forests protecting big core areas, big blocks of the best habitat. This picture is from the Adirondacks. It wasn't until the 1970s that we started to realize that this wasn't enough. And it wasn't until 2007 that the first significant policy appeared when the Western Governors Association released its resolution called Protecting Wildlife Corridors and Crucial Wildlife Habitat in the West. And that makes sense because it wasn't until we had begun to substantially disrupt connectivity that we realized how important it was. There was a time when everything was just habitat. Here's a screenshot of a random place in the North Main woods. I actually had to zoom in pretty far to not get a road in it. But now much of the Northeast looks closer to this. And so let's zoom in a little bit on here to give you a bit of a sense of scale. I labeled these blocks as core areas with some approximate acreage. These are approximate area of forest cover. These things work on many scales. So this is a smaller scale core area, but as an example, this is a much more typical landscape for northern New England and even some parts of southern New England. And I'll also note, in case you didn't notice, there's some clearings along this ridge right here, and I'll just zoom in on those so you can see what they are, which is also pretty typical for this region and time. And there are little connecting bits of forest here, which are what we would refer to as a corridor. You can see a road goes through this one, which is not ideal, but this is connecting these two core blocks of habitat. So starting in around the 1970s, we realized we needed more than just cores and started thinking about connectivity and corridors as well. And then in the 1980s, along came this term, rewilding. The term rewilding started in the 1980s with members of the grassroots organization Earth First. And I always say it that way because there's an exclamation point at the end. It originally referred to a conservation strategy of protecting the 3 C's: cores, corridors, and carnivores. Cores we are familiar with as a concept. Corridors ensure the connectivity between those core areas, and carnivores because of the outsized effects they can have on the ecosystems that Mark just told us some about and we'll talk more about. I'm going to add a fourth, which is coexistence. Some people use other terms there, but just sort of to note that none of the other C's will survive if humans can't learn to coexist with them. Now, rewilding it's usually described as sort of passive or active. An example of active rewilding is carnivore restoration efforts. I used a clip of the wolf reintroduction in Colorado here, but Mark ended on a great example of potential carnivore restoration in the East. And then passive rewilding, an example of that is wildlands, which is, of course, what we do here at Northeast Wilderness Trust. So passive rewilding is just sort of stepping back, not managing a landscape, and letting nature direct the ebb and flow of life. This kind of conservation, just like cougars, goes by many names: wilderness, wildlands, ecological reserves, forever wild conservation. They're all sort of slightly different ways of saying a really similar thing: passive rewilding. And I took this definition of wildlands from the Wildlands in New England report, and this was published in 2023. Northeast Wilderness Trust was one of the partners that put this out. I'm not going to read it, but it's a great, I think, definition of what we mean by wildlands and what the value of the work of Northeast Wilderness Trust is protecting these wild places. This is passive rewilding, and it's about autonomy for nature. I think that's the piece that really stands out for me. Now, the Wildlands report, the 2023 Wildlands report, only covered New England. So I'm going to show you some maps, and they're going to be limited to New England just because they came from the Wildlands report. But there are similar numbers if you expand them in the region. So just to be clear, many cores and corridors exist now. This is 81% of New England is forested. And that forest habitat across New England is in pretty good shape, but protection into the future is what ensures that these things sustain. And while conservation land more broadly is pretty well represented, only about 3.3% of New England is wildlands, and some animals, particularly many larger carnivores, prefer to den and raise their young in wildlands, areas with disturbance regimes closer to what they evolved with. These include lynx and martens. So this lack of wildlands and the areas with low disturbance and long-term continuity of ecological processes has important implications for rewilding. And this is where the work of Northeast Wilderness Trust is so important with our mission of protecting forever wild landscapes for nature and people, as Sophie said at the beginning. And that's sort of my quick little spiel, and I'm gonna just end my screen share here and let us transition to discussion time.
Thank you, Shelby. That was great, as always. Yes, so Mark, come on back on, and our next segment is going to be the conversation. Before you two get started, I just wanted to remind the guests about the Q&A will follow this conversation, and some of your questions might be answered by their conversation. And of the others, I'm going to try to group ones that are similar, and we'll get to as many of them as we can, and hopefully yours will get answered, but there's starting to be a lot. So I do have one question just for the two of you to kind of get started. So are cougars or mountain lions already in the Northeast or not?
I'm gonna let Mark take that
You
one.
want me to take that? There are literally thousands of sightings reported to state agencies and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife every year in eastern U.S., of which the vast majority are not mountain lions at all. You know, it's and then those tiny percentage, you know, what's cool is that there are a tiny number that end up being mountain lions. But for those cases, the times we've been able to get genetic material from these animals, so it could be fur, it could be a poop that we can extract genetics from. If we can get that kind of material and see, you know, what can we learn about this animal? All of the ones that we've really done that for tend to be from South America, which indicates that they're probably not from New England, that they somehow were brought to New England and released. So I hope that makes everyone feel good. One, that, yeah, there's no breeding populations of mountain lions in the East, but that if you are certain you saw one, please feel vindicated that that could be true, because there are numerous confirmed cases where mountain lions have been verified by experts in the East, well over 100 in the last, I can't remember, 10-ish, 15 years. So I myself, I can tell you, when I lived there, I did, I think, 54 different cases where I was called in to confirm mountain lions, of which one ended up being a mountain lion in the Quabbin Reservoir in Western Massachusetts, and not from there, but it ended up being a mountain lion. So it was pretty cool. And I have endless stories about how convinced everyone is. I'll just briefly share one because it was amazing to me. I met with a guy just north of the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and he watched a mountain lion with his wife cross the road in front of him, and there was an inch of snow, perfect. So he took photos of the tracks, and he put his glove next to him, and he had all of this, and he showed up and he just laid it all out for me. And I was like, okay. And he's like, it was chocolate brown and beautiful, and it crossed in front of me. And then he showed me the footprints, and every foot had 5 toes. And I was like, this is beautiful photography, and is absolutely the footprints of a fisher. And so by the end of it, all he said to me was, you can say whatever you want. I saw it. It was a mountain lion. So
We all get to believe what we need to believe in the end.
Sure.
I'll just add one thing, which is that there's a wonderful book called Heart of a Lion by Will Stolzenberg that follows the journey of that cat that ended up in Connecticut, and talks about some of those, like chasing down some of those false leads and some of the real ones across the country, but including the Northeast. It's a beautiful read if anybody's really interested in this stuff. So Mark, I have a question for you, which is, you talked a little bit about ecological impacts of mountain lions, but like, what kind of a difference would it make if they just sort of plunked down all around us here in the East? What kind of ecological impacts could we expect?
That's a great complex question. And it's really good because I think what we've learned in the last 10 years about how carnivores impact ecosystems has really changed, and so for years you'd hear the argument that like, we need to restore a system, bring carnivores, boom, instant change, bam, gone. And just look at the benefits. They'll reduce the number of deer. We'll see, forests be relieved of the deer pressure. New things will grow. Songbirds will return. Beavers will start to swarm. I mean, everything will be wonderful. And I guess what I would say is that we need to temper our expectations, that the impacts of carnivores on ecosystems are very real. But the impacts of humans are so much greater. And so wherever you have a human-dominated landscape, the impact of the carnivores is hard to see and appreciate because they're so overwhelmed by the impacts of people in that ecosystem. We've learned that now around the globe. The second thing that we found is that the timeline of seeing these impacts of large carnivore return or recolonization, reestablishment, are a heck of a lot slower than we thought. And so, yeah, they're going to help build resilience. They're going to help shape systems, but it's going to take a long time to really have a measurable impact on biodiversity, et cetera. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It just means that we need to temper our expectations about what's coming. And then the third point, there's three real keys here. The third thing is that we can't go back, meaning that a lot of folks pitch carnivores or rewilding like, we're going to go back and return the system to 300 years ago. That just doesn't seem possible. What we can do is influence a system and revitalize it. But it probably, you think of it like this, you start at system A and you now have deteriorated to system C, and your goal is to go back to system A, go back 300 years. And what you end up usually doing is going to an all new system that's system B. And you go, oh, but that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. System B is often better than A. It is a revitalized system. It's a healthier system, but going back to the real like historic community assemblage of New England, that's impossible. There were no earthworms. There was like, there's just so many things that have changed that are impossible to go back and change now.
Yeah, we at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we have that conversation a lot about forests where we say we're going to protect wildlands, and people sort of envision these like pre-colonization forests, these, old growth forests of before humans got here. And I always like to say we're protecting sort of the thriving and resilient ecosystems of the future. And they might look different from what we, think was here in the past, but that doesn't make them any less important. And I think, yeah, having carnivores there is all the better for building those sort of resilient and functioning systems, even if they're not the sort of perfect picture of the past that we think they should be anymore.
Perfect. Yep, exactly.
And sort of speaking of the past, so here in the US in particular, I think we have kind of a long cultural history of reintroducing species. Can you talk a little bit about that, how this work has sort of changed over the years, or how Americans appreciate it?
Yeah, no, I think that's so important to emphasize is the United States in particular, like one of our core traditions in conservation is moving species around and revitalizing lost populations through what we call translocation. And we've done this far more than most countries around the world. We've done it in every US state. We've moved species around. We've done it for well over 600 species at this point. And there are huge success stories like elk, white-tailed deer, bighorn sheep, as well as species that maybe people don't think about, like snowy egrets and different kinds of butterflies, river otters, swift foxes, fishers. There's just so much sort of traditional conservation value in moving these species and reestablishing them in lost range. And so that's, I think, one of the things that we should be proudest about as Americans, and that we can continue to build upon, that we are a country that boldly moves species to where they used to live to reestablish lost populations. And that, to me, is a good thing.
Yeah, that's really neat. I did a presentation a little over a year ago where I looked into just specifically for Vermont species that had been extirpated and reintroduced. And I was pretty surprised to learn, and I have just a little list over here on my other screen. And those included beavers, white-tailed deer, river otters, black bear, non-migratory Canada geese, turkeys, moose, martins, fishers, and loons were regionally extirpated and may or may not have been brought back. There's a little bit of fuzzy information about that. So we've done it over and over, even here in the Northeast with species that
Imagine,
many of us
yeah, can
think
you
of as-
imagine Vermont without those species? It wouldn't be
Yeah,
Vermont, you know, I
they're-
mean, like these are things that we just take for granted now that these species exist, and we don't realize they're built upon our conservation tradition of moving species and reestablishing lost populations.
And so speaking of populations, one final question for you is, I know cougars so their populations in Florida are maybe a little bit more on the edge, but they're very well established in the West. But they have experienced significant range contraction over the years. What do you think reopening this sort of formerly inhabited range in the East would do to mountain lion populations as a whole?
Ah, it's super exciting to ponder. And, you know, we just did some math recently where we've been trying to estimate how many mountain lions might live in the United States and Canada right now, and how many could live here if they were to actually return to historic range, even just given habitat availability today, including all the highways and the people's houses and the strip malls and all that stuff. There's still tons of habitat. What if we could get mountain lions to live across their entire former range in the US and Canada? We could likely triple the number of mountain lions in the US and Canada if we could see them return across the East. And that's not because there's twice as much habitat available in the East. It's that there's a lot of habitat and it's better. So it will support greater numbers of mountain lions than places in the West.
Wow, that's really neat to think about the possibility there. Just as a person who has lived most of my life in an area not inhabited by mountain lions, although pieces of it have been in mountain lion country, though I've never been lucky enough to see one. It's really fun to think about the potential to have mountain lions here. I think one of the things I think about a lot when I think about mountain lion restoration is that I might not even notice because they're such cryptic creatures. Like I lived in California and Wyoming and I shared woods with them. I'm sure I shared trails with them. I found their footprints, but I never ever saw one. And I wonder, do you think it would be similar here?
For sure. You know, I mean, most folks that see them now, it's on a Ring camera or a a trail camera in the backyard, but that has increased sort of the visibility of the species for sure. But yeah, they're just invisible and they live in between us. And where I live now in westernmost Washington, it's similar to New England in that it's rural landscapes. People have 5 acres, people have 2 goats in the backyard. It's sort of that rural living that New England folks tend to love and cherish. And it's true, they live in between us, and importantly, we can peacefully coexist with them with some, common sense changes in the way we live. Number one being protecting our animals, not just tethering goats in the backyard that's, forested. You actually have to put them in an enclosure at night. But with these tiny changes that we can live and they can live peacefully and be invisible all amongst and around us.
And I'll just add that some of those changes would be handy for bear safety right now already. So we could start learning already.
Exactly. All right, looks like our time is
Yeah, I think this conversation could go on all night, but we do have questions, and I like kind of wrapping that segment up with coming back to coexistence, because I love that you added that to the 3 C's, Shelby, being an old earth firster myself, just like I think the coexistence is really where it's at now that we can see that we are just everywhere. So here's a question. And so there's a couple on kind of how mountain lions coexist with other carnivores. So one of them is just like, can they coexist with like bobcats, coyotes, bears? What does that look like?
Fascinating question. I mean, it's actually something I love because it's all about the relationships between animals. It's my favorite topic. And so it varies species to species. They absolutely can coexist with all of those animals and more. Where they overlap with wolves, wolves tend to be their primary, well, let's just say it's the primary cause of death for kittens less than 6 months old, where they overlap, is what we found in Wyoming. So that's a big deal, but it doesn't mean that mountain lions won't coexist with them. They just live differently. They stop using open habitat where there's no retreat. They retreat to the sort of forests and the rocky areas where they can be safe and retreat to cover quickly should a pack of wolves come around a corner. The black bears and grizzly bears push them off their kills frequently. In some places where densities of bears are really high and other sources of food for bears are low, like berries and salmon and things like that, they can have an impact on the kill rates of cats. They can actually increase them, and cats will start killing deer more often just to compensate for all the food they lose to bears. They can have, in general, I'd say bobcats, all the smaller carnivores, coyotes, etc., they just tend to avoid each other in space and time. So you'll see them on the same game trail camera, but just at different times of day, different times of night. But in a couple of places, they have been shown to have real impact. So in Eastern Oregon, there's some cool work that showed that mountain lions were killing 25% of the coyotes in that area every year, which is mind-blowing to think that they could have that sort of level of impact. But that's also a part of the world where there's no foxes. And it seems like where there are no foxes, that coyotes tend to fill the niche and start scavenging more cat kills, making them vulnerable to being killed. Just like where I am now, we have no foxes, and here the bobcats fill that niche. And we do see more bobcats killed by mountain lions here than anywhere else I've ever worked because of that relationship.
Huh, that's so interesting. So somebody else had a very specific question about whether there's any research or evidence about interaction between pumas and jaguars.
Not
So like the
much.
southern, okay.
Yeah, so we know a couple of things. There is evidence that jaguars once in a while kill pumas or mountain lions. That's been documented very few times, but it happens. We know that mountain lions will scavenge at prey killed by jaguars, so they're benefiting, they're stealing free food. And then the third piece I would say is that there was a study in northern Mexico where jaguars are small relative to other places in their range, and mountain lions and jaguars are more similar in size. And there was no evidence that jaguars were dominating mountain lions in terms of like the times and places where they were active on the landscape. So there's not a lot of work, but it suggests that at least in that area where they're more similar in size, that mountain lions were far more abundant in that area and seem to be doing fine. In other places, we know where jaguars are super abundant in Pantanal and other parts of Latin America, mountain lions are scarce. And we don't know if that's because they're being
Right.
outcompeted or pushed out or just slight habitat differences.
Are there any state initiatives like Colorado's wolf measures to reintroduce cougars or red wolves, like as opposed to federal projects?
Not at this time. So there have been lots of states who have moved cougars within their state jurisdiction. Florida is the only place where they've been moved from one state to a different state. And that's happened twice. And they're already talking about the need to do it again to increase genetic diversity in the Florida panther population. But at this time, there is no other work that I'm aware of to reintroduce or to move mountain lions around. Shelby?
Nothing that I'm aware of, no. But I will note that states sometimes do list cougars on there and wolves on their state wildlife action plans, which do sort of open up the possibility to do work on those species. So that is a venue where that work could be expanded. And the state wildlife action plans are in a 10-year revision is due by the end of this year, I believe. So those lists are coming out. So check your local state's list of species of greatest conservation need and see if cougars or wolves or any species of interest makes the list in your state.
Yeah, that's a great point, and a great way for you to participate in that public process, because there is participation. They want to hear from you. And historically, some states feel like, hey, if a species is not in our state, we're not going to list it because we got enough problems. We got to deal with the species that are here in conservation need. But I think in our group, we would advocate for including those species that have been extirpated in the past, because it does open the door for conversations. It doesn't guarantee a state will invest in any way in the restoration of that species, but at least greases the wheels and creates opportunities to use federal funds that match state funds should they decide to do so. So it's an important time to do that. Call your agency, find out who's in charge of the swap, they call them swaps, and tell them that you would like certain species listed.
Slops. Okay, and species of most concern. That's good to know. It's nice to know something we can do, like an action we can take in these times. It feels like it might be for a positive good. So there's a question here that says, for Shelby, can you remind us, oh boy, siren going by downstairs. Okay, can you remind us of the definition of wildlands? Could you talk more about the difference between wildlands and forest and how this difference impacts wildlife?
Okay, well, the definition of wildlands, I can read from the Wildlands report, which I have over on this slide, which is wildlands are tracts of any size and current condition permanently protected from development, in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural processes to prevail with free will and minimal human interference. So that's the definition of wildlands from the Wildlands report published in 2023. And the difference between that and forest, I would say it's a Venn diagram. Some forests are wildlands. Not all wildlands are forests. Not all forests are wildlands, but there is an area of overlap. Wildland is not necessarily like a special place. It's a special commitment that we make to a place. It's a decision that humans make to say, this place is for nature, not for us. And so it can be forest, it can be desert, it can be high elevation mountaintops and swamps and bogs, and it can be all the things anywhere that we feel like putting it. What that means for wildlife, well, it depends on who you're talking about. There are a lot of species that benefit from wildlands. There are a lot of species that benefit from different kinds of management. There's a lot of forest management that we do for specific species. This is really common for game species. We manage for white-tailed deer and upland game birds and turkeys and things like that. We want to put more species in our forest that those things like to eat or want for habitat features. The wildlands, they tend to benefit the species that are often rare or uncommon in the Northeast, just because they often need that sort of structural complexity of those, I'm going to call it continuing ecological processes. So the forest develops over time, and as trees get older and fall down and things happen without humans taking that biomass out, you get all these structures that provide really important habitat for things like martins and fishers and lynx. And a lot of these species can live in the managed landscape, but might prefer to den or forage or do some parts of their life cycle in an unmanaged landscape, particularly raising their young because of just the way that disturbance can, have fear impacts, ecology of fear. So it depends on the species. It depends on the time in their life. It depends on what you're interested in and what kind of landscape you're in. So I can't really give like a wildlands are great for X, Y, and Z answer. But there are certainly wildlife that benefit from wildlands, just like there are wildlife that benefit from forest management And I think it's really important to have both on the landscape so that we're benefiting sort of the full suite of everyone who can live here.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to your slide about, 80% forest and 3% wildland. So like needing more of a balance, because the wildlife that does do better in wildlands, there's just not very much of it.
Yeah, and it's not very
Whereas if you do well in a managed forest or somewhere where there's, management or harvest going on, you do well there, then you're doing pretty well. So, all right, great. So how might, kind of in the same line, how might mountain lion reintroduction affect forest resilience and health relating to white-tailed deer in southern New England? So I'm not.
Yeah, I kind of, that question kind of came up earlier and I guess I didn't really answer it. But where there are a lot of deer, we cannot expect mountain lions to really crash their numbers. They generally act as what we call a limiting factor, meaning they kind of act like a bookend. So we should see a reduction in the number of deer where they're overabundant, but it's kind of, there's two ways of saying this. To the folks who are hoping that they're really going to help curb deer numbers, they will help. They probably won't help as much as you hope. To those who are worried that mountain lions will come in and wipe out all the deer and then you won't be able to hunt or, see them in your backyard and do whatever you do with deer, I can almost assure you with 100% certainty won't happen either, because their impact just won't be that dramatic. And even to get to any impact at all, that you'd need a lot of mountain lions. You can't just bring in 50 mountain lions and turn them loose in New England and expect any change in deer numbers. But once they fully establish, you're going to see a bit of change.
Okay, thank you. So we've had some questions about the home ranges. So what are the average home ranges of male and female mountain lions, like in square miles?
Sure.
And do they overlap? The males?
Yes, they overlap, but males overlap with females. So typically a big male home range on average is 250 to 350 square miles. Big. And they'll overlap with 3, 4-ish females in that range, who tend to have smaller home ranges of 60 to 80 square miles. And so that's sort of the typical size. A female, we assume, is establishing a home range based on the needs to sustain themselves and their potential kittens or future kittens, and a little bit of a male. Whereas a male is establishing a home range really about, they need food, but what they really want is opportunity to mingle with females. So it has to be big enough to give them greater opportunity by overlapping multiple females in their range.
Gotcha. Okay. So if a mountain lion reintroduction were to be planned, how many animals would need to be released and in what conditions? And secondly, this is a two-part, what kind of agencies and organizations would need to be involved for it to succeed?
Yeah. These are important fundamental questions. And so dodging the first a little bit to go to the second first, there's really 3 ways that we could see a reintroduction. One, it's federally led, which is unlikely because that the regional subspecies was declared extinct. So there's no need for the ESA to be involved in any sort of restoration of the species in the Northeast. Now, we could also point to the administration probably downsizing its investment in wildlife restoration and conservation in the next 4 years at least. So
ESA, meaning Endangered Species Act.
That's right. So that would be exactly leveraging the Endangered Species Act to do a formal restoration, because in general, species management is done at the state level. So that's the second avenue, is that it would be state-led. And for a state to do a restoration, it's pretty formulaic. The first thing they do is what's called a feasibility study. And this is a formal process during which they talk to all the kinds of people in their state and they say, what do you think? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? They assess whether there's habitat, whether there's enough deer, if we're talking about mountain lions, and other kinds of prey. They do all of this. They check all the boxes. Is there great support for it? That's the big one, right? Do people want this or not? Because it's really ultimately a political decision. Is there prey? Is there habitat? How many animals? Where are we going to get them? All of those kinds of things are addressed in a feasibility study. And I bring that up and emphasize it because that's another way to participate. If you are supportive of this idea, you need to start telling people you want a feasibility study. It does not ensure a state will act on the feasibility study. They can do a feasibility study and at the end of it be like, you know what? This is a terrible idea, and they don't move to a restoration plan. And that's fine, but they have to begin with the feasibility study. And that's something we can openly and vocally support. Please do a feasibility study. The third is tribal led, because there are many parts of the country where a tribe, because they're an independent sovereign nation, and often with their own land, that they make the decision to reintroduce a species. And we see that over and over. Where I live in Washington, we have several clear cases, and in which case it's not a decision made by the state. Hopefully the state gets involved, because when you reintroduce a species that's wide ranging, they will leave a small patch of land if that's where they're reintroduced. And suddenly it's a coexistence question for a much broader set of people and communities. And so, but those are the three ways that we could see mountain lions reintroduced in the East. The first question was about how many and all those kinds of things. There's a lot of research done on this, like how much genetic diversity you need, how many places would you need? Would you want one place or two? I'm not going to speculate on the exact numbers because our group hasn't tried to crunch those numbers. We haven't got that far yet. If we can get a state enthused about this, then certainly we do that hard work to determine exactly how many and exactly who would be the source populations. And I hope we get there, because those are questions I hope we can answer sometime soon.
Yeah, that would be great. I just wanted to say something to all the participants. Thank you so much for being here. And we're going to be here for about another 20 minutes and make sure we get wrapped up by 8 o'clock. So I'm going to keep rolling with some questions for you guys. The next one I have here is, so wolves and beavers appear to be a team for rewilding, with Yellowstone as a great example. Do cougars work with other species such as beavers to do their ecological work?
I'm not sure what you mean by work together. They eat beavers.
I wonder so I didn't write the question, but I wonder if it has.
But those two species are highlighted as like ecosystem engineers, right? They have disproportionate impacts on ecosystems. They expect when you bring beavers in, you're going to see change, right? Imagine you've got this pristine river. It flows one speed from its source to its exit. And then you throw in beavers and oh my gosh, you've got slow periods and fast water and cold water and deep water and, shallow water that's warmer. And suddenly you have a greater diversity of species and structures of kinds of ecosystems in that river. That's the cleanest example. Radical change, super fast. Wolves is more about what I talked about previously, that we have to temper our expectations. There will be change. It is slower than we think, and that it is more of an invisible, slow process during which they will reinvigorate the system and reinforce its resilience and health through interactions with many species. Could cougars do that? Mountain lions, pumas do that as well? Absolutely. And it's because they are so connected to so many kinds of animals. You find that like you introduce cats and you'll see food linkages in a food web just radically increase. All these different kinds of animals interacting more often. And I like to use that as an example because you think of when an ecosystem's impacted by a fire or a disease or a clear cut. Any of these things is like a wound, you might say. And how does that ecosystem heal itself? It moves energy around to sort of fix the hole. And the greater number of linkages in a food web, the more ways you can move energy to get that wound addressed. And so cats increase the number of linkages in ecosystems like radically, and therefore would have a great effect on an ability for an ecosystem to recover after something like a wildfire or disease. Shelby, you want to chip in there?
Well, I love the idea of wolves and beavers as like rewilding buddies, but they don't actually work together. They're just two species that are often like cited side by side as having these big ecosystem impacts. So I think we should pick a rewilding buddy for cougars that we want to bring with them. And I don't know, we could have some examples. I think like the American eel, that'd be really cool. They don't have great PR right now, but they have big impacts in the river. So, you know, maybe they could stick them onto a cougar and that would be good for their reputation.
Yeah.
I wonder, I didn't write the question, but I remember I read Ben Goldfarb's book on eager beavers and why they matter. I can't remember the whole title, but in there he did talk about beavers and wolves needing to be introduced together, and it doesn't make it so when you introduce beavers, the idea was that like the beaver's main competitor for food around the shore of their wetland are deer. And they found that places that had wolves, the deer are still there, but they kind of keep moving along. They don't just like plunk down and graze all the time around the lake. And I don't know if this is true or not, but wonder if that's the question was like,
yeah, no, I
something
hear
you
what
need to
you're saying.
introduce with a mountain lion. Yeah.
I think actually, if I remember correctly, it was that Trophic Cascade video about Yellowstone that I think it's like David Attenborough narrated, where they talk about wolves and how the wolves kept the things moving, and then that made the beavers come back. And I think in the book Eager, he was talking about how actually that wasn't totally true. Yellowstone had been working on reintroducing beavers for a really long time. Separately, that was a very intentional effort to encourage them. That was not all thanks to the wolves. It's not like the wolves came along and the beavers were like all of a sudden free to just have trees to eat and build their dams. There were two sort of parallel projects happening there, and they both had really important impacts, but they maybe couldn't all be attributed to the wolves. I think Ben Goldfarb was making the argument that the beaver impacts were sort of separate and also very intentional.
Right. Very cool. Yeah. You would
Totally
think that
cool.
because you think a beaver would be like a little meat packet running around in the woods for a wolf to grab.
They're big meat packets. And
Yeah.
I mean, one of the cool things we found is that there are certain cats really go after beavers. You know, they all have their sort of individual palate, and there are those, especially males, it seems, in multiple populations, males have disproportionately hunted beavers. But that's another way they can impact the ecosystem. So you've got Vermont, for instance, that has beavers. What will happen when you introduce a species that hunts beavers? Because it will, through the beaver and the removal of beavers, start to impact the shape of rivers, which again contributes to biodiversity and sort of just the way that things are distributed on the landscape. All of that's good. You want sort of what we call heterogeneity, which is that things aren't the same everywhere. It's different wherever you look. Anything where you can vary the amount of trees or the speed of water or the kinds of species, that's all generally good. That generally supports healthy systems.
Mhm.
And I think right now, in the Northeast in particular, because beavers have some predators here, but they're pretty big for most of our carnivores to handle. So they don't get gotten very often. And so they're quite brazen. Beavers here travel very far from water, and they're not very efficient overland travelers. So I think one of the faster impacts you could see is just beavers clearing land in a sort of tighter area to the water that they're in and needing to move around more rather than stay in a single pool and go further and further for trees, which they do now. I mean, we've noticed places on our Eagle Mountain Preserve where beavers are traveling like 100 yards away from the water over land and cutting down trees and dragging it back, which is quite far when you're a waddling meat packet to risk being on the land.
Yeah. I'm just remembering one piece that I thought would be worth sharing is the there was a cool study in Yellowstone that looked at how cats and dogs, so mountain lions and wolves, moved around elk. And they found that actually mountain lions had a greater impact on the movements of elk, keeping them going around the landscape, than did wolves. So both species have that influence, but that cats had a bigger one in that system.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions I want to try to fit in here. So one is, what traits make cougars so adaptable to the many climatic conditions and ecosystems? From Chile to Canada, like, why are they so widespread? How can they do this?
That is a great question that I have not sure I know the answer to. I mean, it really is a great question. And I think like I have this discussion in our organization, Panthera, we're all wildcat conservation people. And we talk about it all the time. Like, why do mountain lions do well when another cat species does poorly? And I think there's some things we can point to. One is that their fecundity is higher than many species of a similar size, meaning that they, on average, produce more kittens per unit time. They generally produce about 3 kittens every 18 to 20 months is sort of the average, and those kittens, because they're a large animal and they have a lot to learn, spend a lot of time with their mother. They generally spend anywhere from 14 to 20 months with their mom before they set off to establish territories of their own. But I think it's that they have good, tight family units, lots of learning, they have good fecundity, and that they're cryptic, and that their personality is non-confrontational. And this is an interesting idea. I call them subordinate apex carnivores, because generally they're clearly a top carnivore. Some of them weigh more than I do. And that they're generally not the top carnivore. There's grizzly bears, or there's wolves, or there's jaguars. And so that they've adapted in a way that seems to make them super cautious about interacting in any way that threatens them, whether it's be people or bears or wolves. And I think that aversion to risk has really helped them survive.
Maybe that's why you didn't see one, Shelby. Okay, so I think this is going to have to be our last question, but it's a great one to end on. So somebody's asked, how do you suggest creating an atmosphere of coexistence between humans and cougars, and not one of retaliation or frustration? How do we cultivate a system where humans value living with large carnivores rather than separate from them?
I'm going to plug Mark's book, The Cougar Conundrum. I think folks should read that book. I think you talk a lot about coexisting with cougars in that book, and I really appreciated reading it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Shelby, what else would you think of before I ramble along?
Gosh, I don't know. This is like the very thing that I think about every day, all the time, is like, how do I convince people to live with wild beings comfortably? And if there were an easy answer, I think we'd be there by now, but it's tricky stuff. I think, mutual respect is really important. Just understanding, we each have a role in the landscape, and we need to respect that other beings belong here, even if they sometimes scare us. I think that's really important. I think it's a really important part of being human to sometimes be scared by nature. I think that's healthy. And yeah, coexistence is so important and so elusive. So I don't know, I guess I'll pitch it to you, Mark. What do you say?
Yeah, it's a complex concept and question. I guess what I would share is a couple of things. One, to remind everyone listening, especially if they are based in the US or Canada, that we are among the nations described as the most selfish, that we really make a lot of our decisions based on what is good for us, our interests rather than a community's interests versus a nation's interests, etc. And that other parts of the world are different, and that they live differently. There are parts of the world where the religion, the local culture creates an atmosphere that facilitates coexistence. Think of India and living with tigers, which kill people far more frequently than mountain lions. They are a real risk to people. And yet, because of the way they live, that most of them are vegetarian, that most of them grow up in a religion that over and over emphasizes that you share your environment with other species as equal participants in that environment, that fosters coexistence. And it has done so for generations. We're just a different culture. So here, the question is, if we want to create or increase coexistence, what do we need to do to change our culture? We need to take a deep look and say, what is our culture? What are our values? And I would emphasize that right now, the narrative around large carnivores, which really is the foundation of our, or reflective even of our cultural beliefs and values, is that they are competition, that they are dangerous, and that we need to control their numbers because that increases human safety and the safety of everything valuable to us, whether that be land, livestock, chickens in our backyard, etc. And that narrative is what's driving this tension around coexistence, and that we can change that narrative. And that's important. I think just to take that moment and say, look, the American perspective on large carnivores is this. It doesn't have to be. And so you look at your source of information, what you think you know about the species, and we can absolutely seize that narrative and change it. And I think that's kind of where I've been in the last chunk of years, writing The Cougar Conundrum, but even since then, more powerfully realizing that I can actively grab that narrative away from those who keep perpetuating those ideas of competition, of danger, etc. And we can write a new one together. And that's exciting, you know, and I have the privilege and the benefit of having traveled a lot and seeing other cultures interact with this species. One place I'll just, you know, talk about specifically is southern Chile, where they are doing tourism with pumas. They are consciously habituating pumas to walk with them. And I'll tell you, the first time I did that down there, walked in the field all day with a mountain lion, in fact, a family of mountain lions, no gun, no truck nearby to run if there was a problem. It was mind-blowing. And then to come back to the US and to share that I had just done this, they would not believe me. I mean, they literally said, you're absolutely fabricating that. And now there's enough pictures on the internet, if you Google search for pumas in Patagonia, that you can see this is happening every day. But this is a place where there have been attacks on people. There are always attacks on livestock. We have a huge project there trying to mitigate the losses for sheep ranchers. And yet they are choosing a more peaceful coexistence because they want to share their landscapes with them. That is so different. And we could do that here. And I know it's possible because the cats that I have spent the most time with through my research projects and Panthera-led work, etc., like there are cats in Wyoming that I got to know so well that I could walk in on their kill, they'd move off 50 yards, I could set cameras around their kill so I could document their behavior, and she would watch me, and then she would come right back as I walked away. And so that sort of relationship is possible if we don't persecute them, chase them, believe that it is important to instill fear in them, because that's our narrative. We believe that's important for human safety. They have to be afraid of us. You hear it again and again and again.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, there are lots of other countries that don't believe that and are living in a different way with this species and seem to be doing just fine.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. Yeah, it's, you know, goes back to that rewilding your heart and then changing the narrative. So, well, we have to wrap up. So thank you, Shelby and Mark, for making time to be here with us tonight and share your work. It's a real gift. I learned a ton, and I'm sure everybody here tonight did as well. So on behalf of all of our participants, thanks for all those answers to the questions, to everybody who's been participating out there in Zoom land. Thank you so much for showing up tonight. It's encouraging to have such terrific numbers. Great turnout, great questions. So wonderful to see all those names, many of them known to me, but many, many more new to me. And so on behalf of Northeast Wilderness Trust, our sincere thanks for caring about wild creatures and wild places, and for spending an evening learning about the role of large carnivores in rewilding. So thank you very much, everyone. Everybody who's attended will be sent a post-event email. And so you'll have the information on the webinar, so you can look up the recording, listen to it there. Also we'll have information on our next speaker series events and Newt happenings. So the next speaker series is Rewilding Across Continents, and that will be on May 6th, 6 p.m. And I hope to see you there. So the websites for both Northeast Wilderness Trust and Panthera are at the bottom here. We'll leave this up for just a moment in case you want to jot them down and come visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, really fun. No,
Thanks
it's
everyone who showed up and listened. So keep in touch.
thanks everyone. Good night.